Hello, ladies of the crossing. It's Rita Santini. I'm going to be doing the chapter recap for chapter 9. It covered Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 24. And of course, this is in our book, Hoping for Something Better. I hope it's been a huge blessing and encouragement to you as much as it's been for me and our life group. We will be finishing this up in the next week or two. I heard that some of you are already finished, so my recap is going to be just a reminder to you, and that's good too. I also just want to start out by saying I am late getting this recap up as always, but this time I actually have an excuse. My son and his wife Brooke had a gender reveal yesterday, and we found out that our first grandchild is going to be a baby girl, so that's a super exciting blessing. And also this morning's been a little crazy. I'm watching 5 kiddos, but they are all currently taking a nap right now, so we are just gonna rely on the grace of God that they stay asleep, and we're gonna get this recap done. So let's get started. So what we noticed as we start to go through Hebrews chapter 12 is we start out with this picture of a race, which I love because many of you know that I was a college track athlete, so this is kind of speaking my language, even though that was about 300 years ago. And what we find through this first part of the chapter is we learn that Jesus is the founder and perfecter of this race, the race of faith. And it starts out by saying that we are surrounded by this cloud of witnesses. And these individuals are, you see this word therefore, and it's talking about the chapter before that Jess did the recap on, and she did a great job on that. And it's talking about these saints that are listed in chapter 11 that have run this race, and they've done it well, and they serve as an example for us as we are running the race, that we can look to them and be encouraged and gain endurance by seeing their lives. And then we kind of go into this section of how do we run a race. First, I will say this: you have to get into the race in order to run the race. So that's kind of our first step, is that you need to get in the race. It's not a spectator sport, right? It's not left bench, got to get off of that. You need to get into the race. And second, we see that it's an obstacle course type of a race. It says we need to lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. Other versions, which I actually appreciate a little bit more, say encumbrances that easily entangles us. I like that picture of being entangled as you're running, and there's something that you just get tangled in, and it prevents you from running and slows you down, and just a good picture. This idea of this kind of obstacle course of a race reminds me of steeplechase. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this race, but it's this crazy race that you run. I want to say like it's 3,000 meters. I think it's like 7.5 laps. And not only are you running this long distance race, which to me is bad enough, but then you are going to be leaping over these hurdles. And on the other side of these hurdles, and they're not normal hurdles, you can actually kind of step on them or kind of jump on top of them as you're running. They're not those skinny hurdles that if you touch them, they fall down. But on the other side is this water. It's like this 12-foot chasm of water. It's angled, so right on the other side of the hurdle, it's deepest. I want to say like a little over 2 feet, and then it slowly gets more shallow. So some people try when they run this race to kind of long jump it. So it combines this idea of hurdles and distance racing and long jumping, and people love to watch this race because a lot of people fall on their faces. So whenever the steeplechase starts, you always would see like people coming around the track to see this race take place. And I would say that it's kind of similar to this race that we're talking about. Although we're not jumping hurdles and water pits and stuff like that, we see that there's weights and sins that slow us down in our race, and they can cause us to fall. And she talked about in the book about obsessions, like the things that maybe they can even be good things, but they are things that maybe we want more than Jesus, that become distractions and they slow us down on this race. And then when we get slowed down, actually, sometimes these things completely just take us off track. We're not even running the right direction. And so I think it's good to be able to identify those things, like what are our obsessions? What are the things that become distractions as we're trying to run this race? And third, what we see is that it requires endurance. This is a long distance race. It is not a sprint, although us sprinters, we did do endurance workouts, but we were not long distance runners. And so endurance is suffering through difficulty without yielding or without giving way. It's the ability to exert yourself for a long period of time and the ability to withstand and resist and recover. There's no shortcut to endurance. It only comes by like hard work and just building up over time as you strive. And as we know in this race, we suffer and we overcome those sufferings. And then we see that endurance also can produce these believers that become resilient. We learn to run faster, longer, harder, and then we recover faster. We also, as she mentioned in the book, that this race is exclusive. We all have to run our own race. God has a sovereign, paved path that we are to run, and we're the only ones that can run it. Although I will add something to that. I will say that this race is also supposed to take place within community, within a team. And we run together. And the beauty of that is that as we're running, and we may fall or we may get tired, we have believers around us that pick us up, that encourage us, that run with us, that we're trying to keep up with. And I think that's the beauty of community and this race that we're called to run. And then fifth, as we run, we need to keep our focus. As she talked about, don't look inward, don't look around, and don't look back. And I think this is super important. As a track athlete, you do not, if any good coach will teach you, you do not look at the other runners, you do not look back, you don't turn. What happens is you lose your focus. You slow down in that process, and then you lose like your total concentration of what you're doing. And you need to keep your mindset on that finish line. And it's the same for the spiritual race, our race of faith that we do, is that we need to keep our eyes focused. And it says, who do we look to? We look to Jesus, who is the founder and perfecter of our faith. He's the example. He's run this race. Not only has he run it, he ran it perfectly. And not only did he run it perfectly, but he created this race. And so therefore, we should be looking to him as our example, as our guide, as our inspiration as we run this race. Let me turn my page. It's kind of windy. I'm losing my pages in the wind here. And what I love too is that Jesus, he runs this race for the joy that is set before him. And I think that's a good example even for us, although there's a uniqueness for Christ, but for us too, that as we run this race, that we should do so with joy and knowing what's at the end of the race, right? About the prize that we gain, about the reward that we get to receive. Our prize and the finish at the end of this race is Christ. And for Christ, his prize was our redemption. So what an awesome, just beautiful picture. In verses 3 and 5, we also see that there needs to be a focus on Christ so that we may not grow weary or faint-hearted in our struggle against sin. And really, God's life, his death, and his resurrection should fuel us to keep running this race and running well. In verses 5 through 11, we see that part of the reason why this race of faith is so hard is because we suffer in sin. I think there's different elements of sin. She kind of touched on these in the book, that first of all, we suffer because we ourselves pursue sin. We sin. And then second, there's a fallen world we live in. It's a world that's full of death, full of sickness, natural disasters, and those things exist because of Genesis 3. As we read through that, it's a fallen world, and those cause us sufferings. And then thirdly, we see that Satan attacks us. And it doesn't always have to be like, oh, this is a consequence of our sin. This is like can be a Job moment where you're just like, Job was this righteous man and Satan just came in and just attacked him. And so those are usually the three things that we see can cause suffering. Obviously, I'm not going into them too deeply, so there's a lot more to that. But we also see that in this next section that it talks about how the Lord disciplines us. It says it is for discipline that you have to endure. And as we submit to God's discipline, what you see is that our endurance gets built up even more so. And I have to say, this to me was like the most awesome moment of this study, because I realized that I wasn't thinking correctly, and it was kind of an eye-opening moment for me. That if you look up the dictionary definition of discipline, it says that it's used to train individuals to obey rules or a code of behavior using punishment to correct disobedience. So my picture is this idea of punishment. I think maybe that's from my past. I'm not really sure, but I have this picture in my mind of punishment that, like, okay, if I sin, the consequences of that is I'm going to probably reap, some kind of suffering from that. And that's ultimately a punishment from the Lord, but it's ultimately my fault because I pursued sin. And I think this chapter just really clarified so much for me, because she says something beautiful in this passage. It says, how do we know that our suffering is not punishment for our sins? Because someone has already been punished for our sin. And so when we think of punishment, that is condemnation. When we think of discipline, we should think about correction, not condemnation. So I think just having that idea as we think about the Lord disciplining us, that it's for our correction, it's to help us to grow, it's kindness. It's not like, here's what you deserve and you're going to get it. So just a good thing to be reminded. And then she talks about some different types of discipline. She talks about how God disciplines us through hardship. We endure hardship as discipline because he loves us as his children. And she talked about an undisciplined child is an unloved child. That was pretty shocking to me, but I think that there's something true to that. A child that is not disciplined is a child that's not protected, a child that has no boundaries, a child that is not being trained up, a child whose heart is not being shepherded. And so in that, I think there's a lot of truth, even though it's a very hard truth. And God does the same with us because we are his child. He disciplines us and he trains us up. And he does it as a good father and a loving father. And then we see that God disciplines us for our good so that we may share in his holiness. And you think about the whole process of sanctification and becoming more like Christ. It's a refining process. So sometimes it's hard and there's suffering, but the idea is that as we are sanctified, we are becoming more and more holy. God's producing something. And then we see God disciplines us for training so that our lives will produce righteousness and peace. And I know I've said this plenty of times to all of you before, but there's some fruit that is only produced through suffering. And I think that's just a good reminder for us. And then the last part I'm not really going to go into just for sake of time, because I'm always pushing the limit on the time. But I will say that if you go back and you refocus on that, it was talking about this idea that we are called to an unshakable kingdom. And the first part is you have not come to, and then you see this like horrible, like long list of angry God, and I don't know, just it's really scary, right? And then the second part, like verses 22 on, is this little section that says but you have come to. And what you see is that we are under a new covenant, and that Christ is our mediator, and it looks different for us. And so in all of this, I hope that this was encouraging to you, and I hope that there's little nuggets that you can take away and be encouraged about, not just for this week, but that things that you can kind of tuck in your pocket and keep forever and be encouraged with day by day. Love you, ladies. Bye.